So let's talk about two of my favorite topics, open source and security. And let's do a brief segue into JavaScript. So JavaScript is actually the world's most popular programming language. And according to GitHub, it's been there for a number of years. But if you're a developer, you don't usually consume JavaScript by just pulling down random JavaScript files off the internet. At least you shouldn't. Instead, you're going to probably use a package format. And for JavaScript, that package format is known as NPM. So as a developer, you're going to start by asking the NPM command line tool to download some JavaScript. And the command line tool is going to reach out to the NPM registry, which contains all these packages. And then you're going to pull down a specific NPM package that contains the JavaScript that you want. So it's a bit of a shell game. And it turns out that NPM is really, really popular. In fact, when you compare NPM against a bunch of other package formats for other languages, it's actually growing about as quickly as all the other ones combined, which is really amazing. In fact, a couple months ago, we passed the 1 million package mark on the public registry. And these are 1 million free or open source packages for the primary part. So it's really quite amazing how many packages there are. So the question arises, like, why is open source so popular? Why is it taken off? Why is it so successful? And this book was written a couple of decades ago called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And the primary thesis of the book is that open source works so well because there's so many people invested in the ecosystem and making it better. And this is a bit of a phenomenon that wasn't really that common prior to open source. The thing is, this sounds great, but it's not universally true. And we've seen a few issues recently that have raised doubts about whether or not open source is as perfect as it may have been portrayed at a lot of places. And so Heartbleed is the name of a vulnerability that was disclosed a couple years ago that affects the OpenSSL library, which pretty much the entire internet relies upon to keep communication secure. And the reason why this is such a big deal is that this vulnerability went undiscovered for 2 years. And this library is open source, and it's part of the ecosystem that everybody's looking at, supposedly. And so the fact that this vulnerability went undiscovered for so long indicates to me that maybe open source has some cracks in its armor that we need to be aware of so that we can use it right. So you might be wondering why I opened by talking about JavaScript, because obviously open source is much larger than just JavaScript. And the reason why I wanted to talk about JavaScript is because JavaScript is highly modular. And it's a bit of an inside joke that when you run npm install, you're probably going to download half of the internet. And so this is why this is the case for JavaScript and for other ecosystems too. So when you write a JavaScript application, you're going to define some top-level dependencies in your package.json file. The thing is, in JavaScript, a package can have its own dependencies. And so what you actually think you're pulling in probably looks a little bit more like this. So at the bottom, that's your code. That's what you wrote. This is code that other people wrote that you're pulling in. A lot of it is stuff you're pulling in without maybe realizing that you're pulling it in. In fact, it turns out that about 97% of the code in a typical web app comes from NPM. This is code that you didn't write. It's really quite remarkable. And there's a lot of great things about this, right? So because you're writing 3% of the code, you're saving a lot of time. And because NPM packages are so great at letting you extend other people's functionality and letting other people extend your functionality, you can reuse solutions to problems instead of reinventing the wheel. And as I mentioned, you can extend them. So this is all great, and this is why open source is so popular and so good. But there are a few cracks in the armor that I'm going to talk about now. And one of those cracks is quality. So as we saw with the OpenSSL library, problems can happen in even very well-maintained, very well-curated packages. And so quality is a bit hit or miss. And if you're pulling in this huge dependency tree, chances are some of those packages aren't the level of quality that you want them to be. And dependencies is the other kind of question, right? So you're pulling in this big, deep dependency tree, 97% of the code that you didn't write. It's sometimes difficult to know what the true surface area of your application is. Like the 3% that you wrote is a very small piece of the iceberg. And unfortunately, it gets a little bit scarier. So attackers can take advantage of this, and do what's called a software supply chain attack to inject malware into some of those dependencies hidden deep in your dependency tree. And also, software tends to age naturally over time. New vulnerabilities are discovered all the time. And so code that was once considered to be good might no longer be good, and again, provide a vector for an attacker. And licensing is its own separate thing, but also if you end up pulling a dependency into your application that's perhaps licensed AGPL, then your proprietary application code might legally be required to be made open source, which might not be what you intended. So there's a lot of kind of pitfalls and gotchas when you're using open source. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about the scope of the problem, I wanted to briefly segue into talking about how some of these attacks happen. So remember our friend, the dependency tree. Let's say that an attacker says, I want to compromise that little application at the bottom. So I'm going to inject some malware high up in your dependency tree, and it's going to flow all the way down and impact your application. Maybe it's a Bitcoin miner or something. So there's a number of ways that this attack can happen. So first, the attacker might gain write access to the registry that's hosting that dependency. This is a bad thing. They might also gain access, publishing access to that package by getting access to their authentication tokens. They were published to GitHub or something. They might also do a typo squatting attack in which they claim the scope or a package name that looks very similar to the legitimate one, and you inadvertently choose the bad one instead of the good one. And then finally, and this is a really interesting attack, you might actually invest in the ecosystem, gain trust on the part of the maintainer, and then because that maintainer is probably burned out for maintaining their package, they're not getting paid to do the work, they are looking for an out, you offer kindly to take ownership of the package, and they say, sure, it's all yours. And then that gives you a chance to inject your malware. And this one is actually something that we're beginning to see a little bit more often now. So of course there are things you can do to help mitigate some of these things. You can pick popular registries that take security seriously. You can pick packages that are protected by two-factor authentication. You can make sure you don't fall victim to typo squatting by checking and double checking the package name and scope. You can monitor changes in package ownership, and just that's a flag that indicates that something might be wrong. But all those things just mitigate the risk. They don't eliminate it. And so how do you know if your application's actually been compromised? And if you find out that it's been compromised, how do you fix the problem? So back in 2017, there was this thing called Equifax that happened. And basically, it was this sort of attack where a vulnerability was disclosed in the struts library, wasn't patched right away, and within 3 days, they'd gotten breached. And that was in 2017. So how has the landscape changed since 2017? Well, today we now have tools like Shodan.io, which let you run a search for public applications and services connected to the internet. And if you know what services are vulnerable to, you can run a search on a website like this, and it will give you a list of all of the services that you can hack. It's rather convenient. So it used to be that you had a few months to deal with these sort of issues, and then you had a few days, and now you have kind of a few hours because all this information is so easily accessible. And to make matters worse, in March, a security researcher published a paper showing how you can use tweets to predict the severity of a security vulnerability with 86% accuracy before it's disclosed on, say, the National Vulnerability Database. So this information is so widely available and so easy to acquire that you don't even have to wait for it to be published in the big security feeds. So where I'm kind of going with all of this is that the time is shrinking to zero, which means that humans being required to do all this manually is no longer tenable. And so what we have to do is start to rely upon automation to help us. And there are a lot of tools that do this, and I've shared a list of them here. The amazing thing is most of these tools are open source, and the ones that aren't have free versions. And I believe all these tools rely upon open source data sets. So not only are the tools to solve this problem open source, but also the data sets that they rely upon, those are also open source. This is great. But again, like process and tools aren't really the end of the story. And if you yourself care about security, but you find yourself in a company that doesn't care about security, what do you do? And so what I wanted to end with was a few things that you can consider as you go about trying to make security treated with more respect and responsibility in your organization. So this is a wonderful book. It's called The Checklist Manifesto. And the book is about this physician, Atul Gawande, who realized that the vast majority of complications after surgery are caused by a small list of things that aren't done prior to the surgery, like washing your hands. And so by giving a checklist of those things to everyone in the operating room, they were able to drastically decrease the number of complications after the surgery with this very low-tech, inexpensive solution. And this applies beautifully to security. If you have a small list of things you know would improve the security of your application, and you have a checklist of those things, it's going to increase the likelihood that those things get done. So this is a great place to start. But checklists don't really scale. And after you get to about a dozen things on your list, it gets a little overwhelming, gets time-consuming, and you probably won't do it. So again, this is where automation can help. Using one of those automated tools is like having a giant friendly robot friend that can work when you're not working, and when your manager tells you to focus on feature development and not fixing bugs or tech debt, you can set your friendly neighborhood robot to keep an eye out for you. And this can actually result in a single person having the ability to have a huge impact on the security of the applications in their org. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that I've done this personally a lot of times where I assume the worst of my colleagues. And something I've observed is that it's usually not the case that someone actively doesn't care about security. It's almost always the case that people don't think about it. And so by being the person in the room who's raising these concerns and educating people about security, and not only the security of your own application, but the security of the users that rely on your application and their data and their well-being, you can have a tremendous impact and start to win people over to your side. Thank you for listening.